All right, so we are in Mandalay EF. This talk is writing badass malware for OS X. Got a lot of content, so I am going to jump right in. So good morning, and thank you so much for attending my presentation. Let's talk about writing badass malware for OS X. So my name is Patrick Wardle. I've worked at a bunch of acronymed places, including the NSA, which I always joke is the only US government agency that actually listens. Currently, I'm the director of R&D at Synack. So Synack does crowdsourced vulnerability discovery with a global contingent of vetted security researchers. So check out synack.com or stop by our booth to learn about how we can help you protect your enterprise. So Synack R&D does all sorts of cool cybersecurity research, and we love our Mac computers. So recently, I've been doing a lot of OS X research, and today I want to present some of that. So the talk today can be divided into 3 parts. We're going to start with a brief overview of OS X malware. Kind of allows us to get a baseline of what is out there. Then the main part of the talk, I'm going to provide some novel ideas about how we can improve this status quo. So basically, we'll talk about how to improve infection vectors, persistence, self-defense, features, and then bypassing security products. And then finally, we'll end with some free security tools that can help us protect our Macs and ensure that we remain secure. Now, I do want to note that this talk does not cover firmware-based or kernel-based OS X malware. I think there's a talk later this week, maybe tomorrow, that looks really interesting. I'm going to be attending it. So if you're interested in kind of lower-level malware, I would recommend checking that out. All right, so I briefly want to look at several recent OS X malware specimens. This will give us a good idea as to the status quo, kind of the current state of affairs in OS X malware land. And then this will provide us, as I mentioned, with a baseline and show us areas where malware could improve. Now, you might be thinking, why do we care about Macs and malware and Mac malware, that kind of stuff? Well, this is kind of an obvious statement, but Macs are pretty much everywhere, especially at security conferences, colleges, R&D centers, board meetings. Yeah, pretty much everywhere. And Apple is now the #3 US computer vendor, #5 worldwide. Now, we all know anytime a technology becomes more prevalent, naturally there's going to be more attacks and more malware. But wait a minute. Apple tells us that Macs don't really get malware. Well, I've learned to not believe everything I read on the internet, especially when it comes from Apple's marketing department. I think they hire more marketing people than security people, but that's just my opinion. Actually, the first computer virus that was discovered propagating, spreading in the wild was called Elk Cloner, and that actually infected Apple computers. Since then, Mac malware has flourished. In the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen about 50 new OS X malware families. Kaspersky just released a report that said last year, actually, there was a significant surge in OS X malware and malware attacks. They saw about 1,000 unique attacks that they could classify into 25 or so new malware families. There's also been scenarios where more advanced adversaries, maybe nation states, have been able to go after OS X users specifically and create new OS X malware and then trivially infect those users. So to me, this all shows that OS X malware is definitely a problem and an unfortunate reality. So the first OS X malware sample I want to talk about is called XSL-CMD. This was found last year by FireEye. It's a fairly basic standard backdoor, provides some decent features, key logging, screen capture, reverse shell. In terms of its persistence, though, it persists as a launch agent. Now, launch agents are fairly synonymous to Windows services. So yes, they will give you persistence, but they'll also show up as a new process. So if the user looks at, say, Activity Monitor or does a PS, they're going to see a new malicious process running. So this is very amateur. So this malware really, again, not that sophisticated. Another recent OS X malware specimen is iWorm. I'm going to be talking about this a little more and actually using it in a demo. It was discovered again at the end of last year. And contrary to its name, it's really not a worm at all. It has no autonomous spreading capabilities, no viral spreading capabilities. It's just a Trojan. It's spread via infected applications because, everyone wants a free copy of Photoshop, right? Again, you would download, you would get Photoshop, but you would also get some malware. Similarly to XSL-CMD, again, a very basic backdoor, provided some basic functionality, download, execute, survey. And again, in terms of persistence, it persists as a launch daemon, which is similar to a launch agent, which again means that the user will see a new process running. So really not that stuffy. Yet another recent piece of OS X malware is WireLurker. Now this is a little more advanced, but only from a feature point of view. It actually had the ability to infect iPhones if the user agreed to install an enterprise certificate. The Mac component, again, super basic, persists as a launch daemon, so again, it's going to show up as new process. It had very basic functionality. Now, the media got all excited about this malware and was like, oh my god, this is so advanced. But there's this quote that I really like from one of my favorite OS X security researchers, which pretty much sums it up. It says, it was kind of just a collection of scripts and binaries all duct taped together, almost surprising that it worked. So again, a very basic piece of malware. And finally, we've got Hacking Team's persistent OS X implant. This was cool because we actually got source code thanks to the leak. So this allowed us to really dive in and figure out exactly what the malware was doing and also look at its level of sophistication. Now, yes, it does have a myriad of features because it was designed to collect intelligence. But other than that, as the quote says, again, there's really nothing technically impressive about this malware, even though it was being sold and used by nation states or dictatorships around the world. So after looking at these cutting edge or these most recent OS X malware samples, we can draw some conclusions and make some generalizations. So in terms of infection, we can see that most use Trojans. They require user interaction. Some do use phishing, but the exploits they deliver kind of older or already patched. So security conscious users, people who keep their computers updated, don't click on random emails, probably going to be fine. In terms of persistence, all use very well-known techniques, majority being launch items. This makes the malware really easy to uncover, detect, and prevent. In terms of self-defense, we see minimal obfuscation, and there's no active self-defense. Somewhat similarly, in terms of stealth, pretty much all just hide in plain sight. They basically will show up in Activity Monitor or in a process listing, but they name themselves Apple something or other, and that's how they try to hide. Also, they're all standalone executables, so again, going to show up in a process listing. In terms of features, this is the one area where I would say current OS X malware is sufficient, gets the job done. But if you look a little closer at how these features are implemented, a lot of times it's done in a very amateur, inelegant way. So say they want to reverse shell, they'll actually bind a shell to a remote port instead of doing it in proc. So if you list the open ports on your computer, you'll see a listening port bound to a shell, which again, really not that stealthy. In terms of personal security bypasses, so bypassing firewalls and antivirus products, we don't see any of this malware have any antivirus or personal security product awareness or trying to actively bypass. Hacking Team's implant did have some stubs for injecting some random garbage bytes to bypass AV-based signatures, but again, that was pretty much it. So the grade I like to give current Mac malware is a C+. So it is sufficient, but it's inelegant, amateur, and trivial to both detect and prevent. So our goal then today is how can we improve the status quo and learn how to write some better OS X malware. Some of you might be thinking, why would we talk about this? We're just going to enable the bad guys. Well, first, to be totally honest, writing proof of concept malware to me is pretty much the most entertaining form of software development. So I just think it's fun. More seriously though, Apple and third-party security products, so the AV companies, firewall products, stuff like that, use this existing OS X malware, which I just showed you kind of sucks, to validate their efforts and vet their tools. So they basically use that as a litmus test. And when they detect these known crappy samples, they're like, yay, our tools are awesome, they work. I'm going to show you, though, how trivial it is to write something better that can generically bypass everything. And obviously, if I can do it, nation states, advanced adversaries can and probably are already doing that. So my goal is to spur discussions to make better security tools so that we can ultimately secure our Macs and prevent them from getting hacked. So let's first start by talking about infection. So how does OS X get on an end user's computer? As I mentioned, most are spread by Trojans and require user interaction. So these are some of the common infection mechanisms. So a website will be hacked or infected. An unwitting user will go there and it says, hey, here's a Flash installer you need to update. It's obviously not Flash, it's malware. If they download it and execute it, they'll be infected. Similarly, adult websites, you go there, it says, hey, to observe this content, you have to install this HD codec or plugin. So I've been told. for research purposes only. And then, of course, infected, pirated applications. Everyone wants Photoshop, free copy of Photoshop, so they download Photoshop, they get it, but it's infected in malware. Now, a few things are going to prevent this from actually being really successful. First, there's a built-in technology called Gatekeeper, which blocks unsigned binaries, and we'll talk about that a little. So this definitely protects some users. Also, smart, security-conscious users are not going to fall for this, so they're going to be okay. So what's a way for us to target such users? Well, if you think about it, we all do download software, and the Mac App Store is very constrictive, in my opinion. So most companies still distribute their software directly from their websites. So you want Photoshop, probably go to adobe.com and get it there. The problem is that this software is distributed to you over HTTP. A network-level adversary can man in the middle of this connection and inject malicious code. Now, you might be thinking, it's 2015, how much software is really downloaded over HTTP? So early this year, I looked at all the software that was installed on my dock, and we can see that about 2/3 of it was distributed to me over HTTP. Now, I don't think it's because the companies are necessarily stupid. They understand, as do I, that there's a difference between securing a download and validating the download. And they all require on this piece of software that's built into the operating system called Gatekeeper to verify that the download has not been tampered with in transit. The problem is that we find a Gatekeeper bypass, which I'll talk about. This breaks this whole scheme and again allows a network level adversary the ability to man in the middle this vector, this software. All right, you still might be thinking, okay, Patrick, you are a malware analyst. You're probably downloading random software from random sites. You know, sure, a lot of it's going to be over HTTP. Then I said, all right, fair. What about security software? These guys are both supposed to be the shining examples of how to do things right. So again, earlier this year, when I went and downloaded the software, I tried to find every piece of security software that I could find. All of them were downloaded over HTTP. It's kind of like blew my mind. I was like, really, guys? The other problem is these all need root to install. So if I'm a network level adversary, I'm just going to wait till a user goes and gets an antivirus product, injects some malicious code into it, and then I'm going to infect their box that way. Now I want to talk a little bit about persistence, which is something that basically all malware strives for. Persistence in the context of this talk just means gaining automatic code execution every time the box restarts. Obviously, this is something that malware likes to do. As I mentioned, the current methods are pretty much all launch items, which are similar to Windows services, and then also login items. These are really lame. First and foremost, they're really not stealthy. So, for example, you can see Mac Protector. That's another OS X malware sample. It's like a rogue AV product. It registers itself as a login item. Sure, this means that every time the computer is restarted, it'll get automatic code execution, so the malware can rerun. But it also means if the user goes and looks at their login items, they will see the malware, and they can delete it from there as well. As a malware author, if your malware is showing up in some UI, you're doing something wrong. Similarly, launch daemons, very easy to detect as well. WireLurker, the malware sample that the media was all hyped up on how advanced it was, it installs 4 new launch daemons. So this means there's going to be 4 new processes, but then also if you dump the launch daemons, you're going to see 4 new entries here. So again, really, really not stealthy, super easy to detect. So yeah, methods that are currently used kind of suck. So let's talk about some better ways. Now, I'm a big fan of binary infection. It's kind of a more old school technique, but it's really very powerful. First, it's really stealthy. If you inject all your viral code into the binary you're infecting, there's not going to be any new processes running. There's not going to be any other files on the file system. It's also difficult to disinfect. Most current OS X malware, you can simply delete an executable and delete, for example, their auto-run plist entry, and your box is clean. The malware is going to be gone. If the malware, however, has embedded itself, infected a legitimate binary, it's probably going to be hard to automatically disinfect it. And then finally, you get load time process injection. Say, for example, you target the user's browser. Every time the browser is executed, your malicious viral code will get executed as well within the trusted context of the browser. So this means if there's a personal firewall that's monitoring for untrusted connection, it's obviously going to trust the browser, which means your viral code is also going to be trusted as well. Now, there's a problem, at least from the point of view of the malware, and that is the OS X loader validates the digital signature. So if we just try to infect a binary, it's going to tell us, get out of here. So how secure is this mechanism at validating these digital signatures? Well, if we look at how it works, basically what the loader does is it looks for a signature block within the binary. And if the signature block is there, it validates it. Recall though, unlike iOS, OS X allows unsigned applications to execute. So what we can do is we can simply pull out that signature block and then infect away. The loader has no concept of state. It doesn't say, hey, this binary used to be signed and it's not anymore, so something weird's going on. It doesn't say, hey, this is an Apple binary that should be signed but isn't. No, it just says, oh, it's not signed. I can't say anything about it. I'm going to let you run. So here we have Safari. There's the original hash. We remove the signature block, inject some viral code. Hash obviously changes, but then we're allowed to run it, no problems asked. So now we can infect away. Now, there's a myriad of ways that you could infect a mock-O binary. It could be a talk unto itself. But some basic ideas, you could obviously hijack the entry point. You could add a new dependency. And again, the benefits of this, it's self-contained, somewhat difficult to detect, and then also difficult to disinfect. My favorite OS X persistence mechanism, though, is dilib hijacking. And this is very conceptually similar to DLL hijacking on Windows. Basically, if you have a vulnerable application, all you have to do as a piece of malware or a malicious adversary is plant a malicious dilib on the file system. And then anytime that vulnerable application is started, either automatically by the operating system or manually by the user, your malicious dilib will get automatically loaded and executed. So pretty cool. So this is conceptually how it all works. There's an application that says, hey, I have a dependency on some dilib. Now there exist scenarios where the loader will basically look in multiple locations for that dilib. So if the legitimate dilib lives or exists in a secondary search directory, we as a malicious adversary can plant our dilib in the primary search path, so that search directory. And from then on, the loader will then blindly, naively find and load and execute our dilib. I'm also giving a whole talk about this at DEF CON, so if you're interested in that, I would love to see you at the talk. So how do we use this for persistence? So on my computer, there is this Apple binary called the iCloud Photo Stream Agent. It's automatically started by the operating system every time the computer reboots, and it's vulnerable to a dilib hijack. So what we can do is we configure our malicious dilib and then save it to this directory on the file system. This is all we have to do. Now, every time the box is restarted, our dilib will get automatically loaded and executed. Benefits, again, it's novel. Anytime you use a novel technique, probably not going to be detected. There's also no new processes. I really like this. The user looks at the process listing, activity monitor. They're not going to see anything amiss. It also requires no binary or OS modifications, so you're not breaking any digital signatures or doing anything that weird. And finally, it abuses legitimate functionality of the operating system. We talked to Apple about this technique several months ago, and their beta software that they're still releasing is still vulnerable to this attack. All right, so that was slicker, stealthier persistence mechanisms. If you're interested in more, I actually wrote a white paper for Virus Bulletin. There's about 20 plus techniques that malware could use to persist. So what about self-defense? Now, I've always wondered why malware does not employ more self-defense mechanisms to prevent analysis or detection. I guess on the Windows side of the house, we see a lot of malware that has anti-analysis, anti-debugging, those kind of things built in. But on OS X, the malware we see really doesn't have that. Sure, some samples are packed, but they're like packed with UPX. So you can just run, UPX-D and, you get the unpacked binary. So this is problematic, I think, because this makes it way too easy for the antivirus companies. It makes it really easy to find the malware, makes it trivial to analyze the malware, and makes it trivial to disinfect. So I want to talk about some self-defense techniques that I think OS X malware could or should be using. Now let's start with talking about protecting our malware. I think encrypting one's malware is generally a good idea. It makes detection harder and also makes it more difficult to analyze. So let's start with a simple method that leverages the fact that the OS X loader natively supports encrypted binaries. This is a cool feature. Apple actually makes use of this to protect some of their applications, I think Finder, the dock, maybe iTunes. But it's a static encryption key, which we can see on the screen, and it's also a symmetrical encryption algorithm. So that means we can write our own custom encryptor and then encrypt custom binaries. So that's exactly what I did. I wrote a little encryptor that can take any compiled Mach-O binary. It can be a malicious one or not. And at the top you see when I run strings on the unencrypted binary, we can see kind of exactly what it's doing. I then encrypt it with this custom encryptor, again uses Blowfish and that static encryption key. And then again we run strings on it, we can see that everything's hidden. I tested this also on some known malware and got about a 50% drop in detection. All right, so that technique is great. It's free and easy. It's free in the sense that OS X understands that, so you don't have to write a custom loader. But since it's a symmetrical encryption scheme with a static key, this also means analysis tools can decrypt this as well. And this is why we only got a 50% detection drop, not 100%. So let's talk a little bit now about an encryption scheme that's a little stronger and that will cryptographically tie the malware to the target that it's infected. This is, in my opinion, a really good idea because the way most malware is detected these days is not initially by the antivirus products. You see the reports that it's like user uploaded an unknown file to VirusTotal, and then 2 months later, the AV guys did some more intense analysis on it and figured out, oh, this is actually malware. Now, if we've tied or encrypted our malware directly to that target, this would prevent, hopefully, that kind of attack because we can ensure that the binary cannot be decrypted or executed on a secondary system. So how does one go about doing this? Well, there's a public research paper that was published in the mid-90s that describes some mathematical constructs about how to do this. I'm not going to go through all of them, but basically I'll just describe the way it works. So when malware gets to a system that it wants to infect, it has a custom installer. And the installer basically queries the environment to get some environmental observation. This could be like the UUID of the Mac computer that it's on. It then uses this as the encryption key and encrypts the persistent component of the binary. It then hashes that encryption key and jams that into the malware. And then the installer self-deletes. Now every time the malware is run, its main component is encrypted with that UUID, and it has that embedded hash. So it has a little loader stub that will requery its environment and says, hey, what's the UUID? It gets the UUID of the system it's executing on, hashes that, and then compares that to its embedded hash. If that embedded hash matches, it knows that it has the correct UUID. Now think about this. If this malware is ever executed on a different system, the UUID it gets is not, when it hashes, that hash is not going to match the embedded hash. So this is why the malware is called clueless, because the malware doesn't actually know what its encryption key is. It knows how to find it and detect when it's the correct one. But if an analyst can't predict what the original UUID was, they can't decrypt that malware sample. Now this is not necessarily a novel concept. We see this used on the Windows side of the house. And again, in my understanding, this is a very powerful technique. All right, so now you have this custom environmentally encrypted blob that you're either storing on the file system encrypted or you're downloading just in time from a command and control server. Either way, you're going to have to write a custom loader because OS X is obviously not going to be able to automatically execute this binary. Now, normally, if you have to write a custom loader, you've got your work cut out for you. So some of us have probably written PE loaders for Windows malware or shellcode. You got to do a bunch of things like mapping the image, loading dependencies, linking stuff in. This is a pain in the butt. Turns out, though, that OS X supports loading of an in-memory file image, which is great. So basically, what the malware can do is has a little stub loader that requeries the environment. If it's in the correct environment, it'll decrypt itself. But then it just still has this flat file image that's in memory that needs to be mapped, linked, loaded. Luckily, OS X can handle such a flat file image, even if it's memory. So we just basically call some OS X APIs on this. And OS X will load and execute it just as if it had loaded it off the file system. Apple used to host some sample code showing this. They don't anymore. But if you Google memory-based bundle, you can find the source code of how to do that. Another self-defense technique is hiding dilibs. I've seen Windows malware do this, but I haven't seen this done on OS X. And when I Googled this, I didn't find any public research discussing this technique. Turns out it's actually pretty easy to achieve basic hiding. In short, there's in-process structures that describe all the dilibs that are loaded within a process. So tools such as debuggers query these in-process data structures to get a list of what's loaded. So what a dilib can do, or an external process, is simply modify these structures and basically unlink the dilib from the list. And this is exactly what we do. We have a little unlink dilib tool that we execute, and it will basically just remove the dilib from the array of loaded dilibs. And then when we use a debugger such as LLDB to query that and say, hey, what dilibs are loaded? I think there's something malicious maybe in here. LLDB won't see the dilib and won't return it. So again, just increases the stealth. Now there's definitely a myriad of other ideas that malware could use to protect or defend itself. I just want to briefly mention two more. First thing we want to do is make the malware harder to delete. As I mentioned, most OS X malware stand alone, and if a user or an antivirus product detects it, they can just delete it, type RM, pop it to a root console, delete it. It's really, really trivial to disinfect. Well, it turns out there's this command, the change flag command, that you can actually make a file undeletable unless the user manually boots into single user mode and executes it there. So this is what we do. You can see we first execute that command on our malicious dilib, and then we're still in the same session. We just set this flag, but we can't now unset that flag or delete that binary. So this, again, complicates deletion and probably prevents an antivirus product from automatically deleting the malware. Another self-defense mechanism is self-monitoring. The worst thing that can happen to a piece of malware is compromise. So malware should know if it's been detected. As I mentioned, the way most malware is found is a user finds some weird or suspicious file and uploads it to VirusTotal, copies it to a USB stick, and then passes it off to analysis. Malware should know if this has happened, right? It's running on the system where that happened, usually. So you can use dtrace or FS events to monitor file system access, so you can see if someone's making a copy of you to a USB stick or even poking around in the directory where you live. You can also monitor the network and see, hey, am I being uploaded to VirusTotal? And then if you detect any of these events, like blow up the computer or at least format the hard drive or something, because this will basically prevent you from being more detected. Another idea I think would be really cool is to, as a malware author, register a hash of your binary with Google as an AdWord. Probably also register a whole bunch of benign hashes as well to kind of blend in. As a malware analyst, the first thing I do whenever I get a malicious sample is I Google the hash, because I want to see, does VirusTotal know about this? Has someone written an analysis report? We as malware analysts use hashes as a way to identify samples. Now, if the malware author had registered the hash of his or her malware as a Google AdWord, they would get an alert that I just Googled that. So this would be a great early warning system for them. They could then, maybe start building a new piece of malware, disinfect their targets, or send some assassins after me or something. All right, so what about some specific features or capabilities? As I mentioned, current malware has sufficient features to get the job done, but I want to talk about one feature that's pretty powerful that I feel is underutilized, and that's process injection. So we're going to start with looking at runtime process injection. Basically, we want to be able to inject code, a dilib, into an arbitrary remote process. Now, the reason I want to talk about this is the public samples that are out there, they're either a little outdated or they're intentionally broken. So let's talk about exactly how we can do runtime process injection. So the first thing is you have to know the architecture of the target process. This is operationally very important. If you try to inject 64-bit code into a 32-bit process or vice versa, this is going to end horribly. Most people don't talk about this, but practically this is a very important step. Turns out it's actually pretty easy to figure out what the remote architecture is. You call the proc PID info function, and this will return a structure that has a flag set to 64-bit or 32-bit. So now you know what the architecture of the target remote process is. You can start crafting some shellcode. This shellcode could do pretty much anything. This is some simple shellcode from the Mac OS X internals website. It does three things. First thing it calls pthread set self, and this promotes the injected thread, which is going to be an injected mock thread, to a fully compliant pthread. And the reason you do this is APIs within the remote process are going to expect your thread to be a pthread, not just a mock thread. So you have to do this, otherwise your shellcode is going to mysteriously crash. It then calls DL open to pull in an attacker's dilib into the context of the target process. This is essentially like calling load library on Windows. And then the shellcode just sleeps. It assumes that the malicious dilib, which is now in the remote process, will do whatever it needs to do. So to actually inject and execute the shellcode, you do 5 things. The first thing you have to do is call task for PID. And this gives you access rights to the remote process. Now you have to be root to do this, so there's not really too much of a security issue unless we can get root, and we'll talk about that in a sec. Once you have root and you call task for PID, you can now start injecting code, allocating memory. So the first thing you do is you allocate 2 chunks of memory. One for the stack of the remote thread you're going to create, and then one for the actual shellcode. You then call VM write to copy in the shellcode. You set it to be executable, and then you simply call thread create running, which is synonymous to create remote thread on Windows, and will start a new thread at your shellcode. So runtime code injection is nice because it allows you to target arbitrary process, but it does have some downsides. So first you need an external monitoring component that's already running. So say you want to inject into the user's browser. You have to have some piece of malware that's already running on the system that's waiting for the browser and then triggers the injection. So this just means more things that you can detect. It's also a touch complex. You're doing shellcode, stuff like that. And finally, it's easy, in my opinion, to detect. Process A shouldn't generally be creating remote threads in process B. So let's look at load time injection. So we can use dilib hijacking to gain load time code execution whenever a vulnerable application starts by simply dropping a malicious dilib. So let's look at Xcode. I thought Xcode, which is Apple's IDE, would make an attractive target for malware. Malware could use this as an autonomous propagation vector, right? If it's chilling in Xcode and it sees the developer building a release version of the binary to ship out, the malware could just inject some malicious code at the source code or compiler level. That's a really super stealthy way for it to automatically propagate. Turns out that Xcode is vulnerable to a dilib hijack attack, so we can simply drop a malicious dilib to the file system, and now every time Xcode starts, our malicious dilib will get automatically loaded and executed by the loader within the context of Xcode. Now, you can have the most sophisticated malware in the world, but if it gets caught, it's game over. It's like the worst thing that can happen for the malware. So I want to talk about bypassing some security mechanisms that either detect or prevent malware, and then talk about how we can bypass them. So current OS X malware is detected or blocked by these security mechanisms. I'm going to start by talking about Apple's. I think this is really lame. Apple loves this, though. They love to tout, hey, our security mechanisms are awesome, they'll protect you. But I'll show you we can bypass all of them. So I think this exudes a false sense of security. So let's start with talking about Gatekeeper. Remember I mentioned that pretty much a lot of software is downloaded over HTTP. They all count on Gatekeeper to verify that the software has not been modified in transit, that the digital signature is still valid. Gatekeeper also blocks unsigned downloads, so it does protect the dumb user who's going to think the Flash installer is really Flash installer. So how does Gatekeeper work? Well, basically, anytime you download something from the internet, it gets tagged with this quarantine attribute. And then when the application that was downloaded is run, either automatically by the operating system or the user double clicks it, Gatekeeper kind of jumps in the way and says, hey, wait a minute, this was downloaded, I got to verify it and make sure that it's signed and hasn't been modified in transit. And it actually does a decent job. Turns out, though, that Gatekeeper only verifies the downloaded application. It does not verify external content, which is normally not a problem unless the application that was downloaded has an external relative reference to some content that it loads. So what we can do to bypass Gatekeeper is, well, 3 easy steps. First, we find an Apple-signed or Mac App Store app that contains an external relative reference to a hijackable dilib. Then we create a DMG or a zip file image, or we could also inject this into a legitimate software download if we have network-level access. And then we kind of laugh at Apple. So this is how it all kind of works. Again, we have Gatekeeper set to the Mac setting, saying only allow code from the Mac App Store. We then build this malicious DMG file. We control the icon, the name, the background, so we can make it look however we want. So hidden behind this is an Apple-signed application that has an external reference to some code that we can actually load. So if the user double-clicks this, they will still get a standard pop-up because the content was downloaded from the internet. Now, this is a generic pop-up that will occur for any software you download from the internet. So even if it was a signed version of, say, Google Chrome, you would get the same pop-up. Note, though, it's saying only allow code from the Mac App Store. We have unsigned malicious dilibs in here that should not get loaded and executed. But because of this vulnerability, they do. So I reported to Apple. They patched it, but as we'll see at the end, we can still get around Apple's patch as well. So now I want to talk about XProtect. XProtect is Apple's built-in antivirus product. Do you guys know that there's actually a built-in antivirus into Mac? And it does a decent job detecting or blocking known malware. So here we can see when a user tries to download an application that has iWorm, it'll pop up and say, hey, iWorm's in this, I'm not going to allow you to run this. Well, it turns out it's a very, very basic antivirus tool that's based on signatures such as files and hashes. So here we can see this is the actual signature for iWorm. It's based on a hash and a file name. This is really lame because this means we can simply recompile the malware, which will give it a new hash. Or if we're writing new malware, we don't have to worry about this at all. Or in this case, if we actually just rename the malware, it's not going to get detected anymore. So trivial to bypass. Apple has a sandbox that sandbox code from the Mac App Store and some of its native apps. This is a good idea because if these apps are malicious or get exploited, the attacker then has to break out of the sandbox in order to do anything useful. Turns out, though, that while conceptually this is pretty strong, our friends at Google are finding tons of OS X bugs, as are some other researchers, that can escape the sandbox. So I really don't think this is an obstacle for any advanced adversaries. All right, what about kernel code signing requirements? So to protect the kernel from malicious code, for example, rootkits or modified kernel extensions that have been infected, starting with Mavericks, all kernel extensions have to be signed. If you try to load an unsigned kernel extension or infect an existing kernel extension, it's going to fail. Now, this is not actually a novel security idea. Windows has been doing this for years, and it's actually, in my opinion, a decent idea. Turns out, though, that the signature validation is done in user mode. This is a total fail because we have a local attacker or some local malware that's trying to load the kernel extension into ring 0. So it's at the same level privilege-wise as the kernel extension signature checks. So obviously an attacker can subvert these checks and load unsigned code. So there's a variety of ways to do this. I think the easiest way is there's this utility called kex load. Kex load basically talks to this daemon and loads a kernel extension after the daemon verifies the signature. If we just unload that kernel daemon, kex load will try to load the extension directly itself. Since it's an open source tool, we can download that tool, just comment out the signature check, and now we have this custom kernel extension loader that will load unsigned kernel extensions. Obviously, you could also directly talk to the syscall interfaces in the kernel, because those aren't doing any checks either, but Apple provides a nice utility that we can use. So again, trivial to load unsigned kernel extensions. Now, for some of these bypasses, for example, to load a kernel extension, you need root. Well, it turns out really not that hard to get root on OS X. There's this great bug called root pipe that was, I believe, introduced in the inception of OS X, so all the way back in 2001. It was recently found by this guy named Emil. Apple patched it, and it took me like 10 minutes to bypass Apple's patch. And that's not saying like I'm all skilled, it's just like Apple's patch was really, really bad. So again, this provided a trivial way for any local attacker to get root on a OS X box. I'm actually giving another DEF CON talk about the details of this vulnerability, how I was able to bypass the patch. So if this is interesting to you, check out this talk as well. Turns out about a week ago, Stefan released another bug that is fully unpatched that again provides local adversaries or malware the ability to get root. And yesterday we actually saw some new malware that started using this in the wild. So again, getting root, really not that complicated. So in my opinion, Apple's built-in malware mitigations, kind of a joke. So what about third-party ones? Well, these are the guys that charge you money and have one job, to protect you. So let's see how they do. Well, it turns out that most of them are based on static signatures. So again, you recompile your malware or just write new malware, they're not going to detect you at all. Some, though, are more behavioral based. So they're more agnostic towards malware. For example, Little Snitch, blocks untrusted connections. So we have to look at these a little closer and see how they work. So Little Snitch is the de facto personal firewall, and it seeks to block untrusted connections. For malware, this is problematic because malware is obviously going to be untrusted, so when it tries to connect to its command and control server, Little Snitch will pop up and block it. So we want to bypass that. Turns out Little Snitch takes a binary approach. It trusts known processes and also allows users to create blanket rules. So on my box, GPG keychain is trusted and it's allowed to talk to the internet. This makes sense. It's a signed application. It needs to talk to key servers, check for updates. Turns out, though, that GPG keychain is vulnerable to a dilib hijack attack. So what we can do is simply plant a malicious dilib and then programmatically execute GPG keychain or wait for the user to execute it. And then our malicious dilib will get executed and loaded within the context of GPG keychain. It can then talk to the internet, and as far as Little Snitch is concerned, it says, oh, this is coming from GPG keychain. I trust that. No problem. A more generic bypass, though, we see Little Snitch has an undeletable system rule that says anybody can talk to iCloud, even if you're unsigned, even if you're untrusted, even if you're malware. It's going to let you talk to that endpoint. I guess they thought computers are normally only synced to one account. So I reverse engineered the iCloud protocol and set up a command and control server on another iCloud account, and then wrote some malware that was able to talk to that. Little Snitch, sees it, says, oh, you're talking to iCloud, no problem, lets you out, no pop-up. So to test Apple and third-party security products, I created some proof of concept malware. It's not the most sophisticated malware, but it's pretty simple, and I think it represents what most malware generally does, which is persist, exfil, and download and execute. So it's distributed as a malicious DMG or zip file. This could also be injected into a legitimate download. It uses the gatekeeper bypass I described to bypass gatekeeper and avoid the pop-ups to execute unsigned code. It then persists as a dilib hijack, so every time the computer is restarted, the code gets automatically re-executes, exfils some users' files, and then downloads and executes a command. You also don't need root to install this malware, although, as I showed, pretty easy to get root. So the test, in my opinion, was fairly realistic. I downloaded all the traditional OS X security tools I could find to make sure they were all up to date. And again, they were all downloaded over HTTP, so I guess I could have been opening myself up to infection at the same time. I then ran the downloaded unsafe.dmg file and basically said, do any of these AV products detect any component of the attack? So I try to skew the test towards these antivirus products, which you have to pay for. And basically said if they detect the persistence, the exfiltration, the download, the execute, any component of this, this was a fail for the malware and a win for the antivirus product. Really not too surprising here. For me, though, none of them detected any of this. So this, in my opinion, kind of shows the ineptitude of this industry. Sweet. All right, so let's talk about some defense. I'm convinced that OS X security is lacking, and hopefully I've conveyed that to you as well. There's public ODAs, there's weak malware mitigations, and it's trivial to write new or improved OS X malware that can pretty much bypass everything generically. So these things scare me because I love my Mac computer and I don't want to get hacked. I've definitely drank the apple juice. I love my Apple products. I love Apple. I don't think they love me, but I can handle that. So I wanted to be part of the solution and help fellow Mac users. So I decided I should write some OS X security tools selfishly to protect my Mac, but then give them away for free. Now, apparently this is a novel concept to the antivirus companies, but don't listen to them. I think they just want your money, and as we see, they're pretty easy to get around as well. So my side hobby, I have a little OS X security website with some free tools. There's also a malware collection that has all the samples that I talked about in this presentation. The AV guys don't really like to share, so I've tried to collect these together, so if you guys want to play at home, feel free. And then also I wrote some tools that can protect your Mac. Again, all totally free. So I briefly just want to talk about these. So the first tool is Knock Knock. It has a simple goal. When I say knock knock, I want it to tell me who's there. Basically, what's persistent on my Mac. So you can see we're going to list things like launch items, kernel extensions, login items. Conceptually very similar to auto runs on Windows. Although in my opinion, this looks way better. My favorite feature, though, is the virus total integration. Since Knock Knock doesn't have a concept of malware, it just shows you what is persisting. It's really nice to have something that can detect known malware. So with the virus total integration, it can do exactly that. It can tell you if something is known malware. It can tell you if a file appears to be clean. It can also tell you if this file has never been seen before, which may be suspicious or interesting. Besides detecting malware, you can also submit unknown files, rescan, view the report. Now, the only limitation or perhaps downside of Knock Knock is it's reactive. You have to manually run it. It doesn't provide real-time protection. So I wanted to write something that provided real-time protection. So I wrote block block. Knock Knock tells you who's there. Block block tells you when someone moves in. Basically provides continual runtime protection, monitoring known persistence locations. Think of it almost like a firewall for auto-run locations. You really don't get a lot of alerts, unlike a firewall, because there's not that much software that's persisting. So here we can see it generically blocking hacking teams' implant. So this implant was leaked after I'd written this tool, so it was kind of cool to see that it generically detected it. And then yesterday, there was a security report that came out, or a few days ago, that talked about some new malware that was exploiting an unpatched ODA to gain privilege escalations. Now, block doesn't detect the exploit, it doesn't block exploits, but when the malware goes to persist, even though the malware is running as root and exploited some ODA to get root, block again can generically protect this. So, not bad for free tools. Another tool I'm releasing today is called Task Explorer. In my opinion, it's a better activity monitor, at least for security-conscious users. So it's got some cool features. You can run filters like, show me all the non-Apple applications that are running, or show me all the unsigned code that's running on my box. Also can quickly show you the signing status of a file, if it's signed by Apple, third party, or unsigned. It's got virus total integration. And then in the bottom pane, whenever you select a task, it can show you what dilibs are loaded, what files are open, what network connections. Similar again to, I guess, Process Explorer on the Windows side of the house. All right, so I briefly want to end with a quick demo that hopefully drives home the point that you shouldn't believe Apple's hype. Next version of OS X is called El Capitan, and there's this I don't know, quote on their website sounds like it's going to be really secure. I don't fully understand it all, but I thought a good test would be to see if an attacker could take an existing known piece of malware and successfully target users running even on Apple's latest and greatest operating system. So a brief demo. Before we get started, I'm going to talk about a few things. First, we have Gatekeeper enabled. It's set to default, saying only allow signed code and code from the Mac App Store. Knock Knock is run. It's found 6 launch items. And then we have 2 instances of iWorm. At the top, we have the current version, which will see XProtect and Gatekeeper blocking, because it's known malware. We then have a second version, which I have slightly modified. I don't have source code for this malware, but I basically just tweaked it so that it can bypass Gatekeeper again and execute the malware even though it's unsigned. The malware is going to try to persist as a launch agent and run as a process named javaw. So I'm going to run this video. Hopefully it runs. Showing Gatekeeper, 6 launch items. I'm going to dump the quarantine attributes for both downloads to show that, yes, they were downloaded from the internet. They have this quarantine attribute set. There's no processes called Java that are running. I'm going to run the first instance, and you can see that it says, hey, Photoshop will damage your computer. It contains iWorm. This is XProtect blocking, protecting the user. I told you it's really easy to bypass that, so we're just going to concatenate a string at the end, which changes the hash. We're then going to try to rerun the current version, which has been modified. We get another pop-up. This is Gatekeeper saying, this is unsigned, I'm not going to allow you. And you can just say, OK, it doesn't actually run it. We're then going to execute the modified version. This, again, has the unsigned version of iWorm. Gatekeeper is going to pop up and verify it still because it's downloaded from the internet. Adobe installer Photoshop's a big file, so it takes a while. When it's done, we'll still see that generic pop-up, but this time, it'll allow us to actually run the code. And the user has just downloaded this, so they're probably going to click yes. If they click open, it's going to finish installing Photoshop. It's going to kick it off. We're going to start Knock Knock again to re-enumerate the launch items. There's this new process running called javaw. And if we dump its code signature, we can see that it is unsigned. There it is. Code object is not signed at all. And then also Knock Knock has detected a new launch item. And since it's known malware, VirusTotal has said, hey, I know about this. I'm going to flag this. I can't go into details because I'm talking to Apple about trying to get them to patch this. I didn't just buy a developer certificate, do something lame like this. Anyways, so that's bypassing the next version of OS X that's supposed to be all secure, using known OS X malware. So that bothers me. So a few conclusions. Hopefully I showed that current OS X malware is kind of lame, kind of amateur, but in my opinion, that has led to complacent security products, both Apple's and third parties. So my goal was to illustrate how simple it is to vastly improve current OS X malware that can bypass all these third-party antivirus tools, firewalls, and Apple's built-in security mitigations. So hopefully this convinces Apple to up their game and these third-party companies to improve their products. And in the meantime, maybe check out some free security tools. All right, thank you for your time. I know I've got a few minutes here for Q&A. I also want to thank my company, Synac. We do a lot of awesome work. We have a cool booth, so come by, say hi. I'll be at the booth, so if you guys want to chat about more of this. So you can download the slides, Twitter, email. I guess we have 2 minutes for questions and answers. Any questions? I see lots of pictures. There's, yes. Does your tool support finding modules that were loaded via NSLink module? That's a good question. I will have to test that. Task Explorer should, unless they've maliciously unlinked themselves, because what it does is it queries that in-process structure. Sorry, the question was, does the tool show loaded modules that have been loaded via NSLink module, which is like dynamic loading. So I will test that. If not, that should be a fairly easy feature to add. So great question. Yes? Great question. There are open source versions of them that I've released. Again, sorry, question, are these tools open source? There's an open source version of Knock Knock and another tool called Dylib Hijack Scanner, which will enumerate hijacked dylibs or show you what applications are vulnerable. The UI versions are not open source though. But if you come talk to me, I'm going to actually be at Black Hat Arsenal tomorrow demoing these. I can show you the source code. You can poke around. Any other questions? Yes, in the middle. I can't hear, sorry. Can you repeat one more time? I'm sorry.
What are you thinking about a Thunderstrike?
Oh, Thunderstrike. Yeah, so there's a great talk later. It looks like some of that requires initial access or, a web-based vulnerability to deliver the firmware update. So again, if they infect you at that level, you're kind of screwed. So hopefully you don't allow anyone to have physical access to your Mac computer. And hopefully, if there's a web-based attack, you're updated, running software. But yes, it's definitely a threat. Unfortunately, these tools all run at the OS level, so they won't be able to detect that. One more question, and then I think we're out of time.
Characterize Apple's response.
That's a great question. How would how does Apple respond? Actually, really good. I've started talking to their security team. Really smart guys. Seem to get security. My opinion, it seems that security in the past wasn't part of the culture there almost. So they are kind of fighting an uphill battle. Talking to them, though, it seems that security is becoming paramount and very, very important. It still seems, though, that when they address security, for example, implement a new patch, they understand it, but maybe not from a malicious adversary's point of view. So like, for example, they did that DEF CON talk I'm giving. They patched the vulnerability, but it was trivial to sidestep the vulnerability. The vulnerable code was there, so I just took a different code path. So to me, it seems like there was a little misunderstanding there. But overall, they seem to really be on board now. They're very positive and work closely with me on this. So I'm hoping in the future our Macs continue to get more secure, even if we have to give talk like that to push them in that direction. All right, so I think I'm out of time. I'll be around here. I'll be at the booth. I'll be at Black Hat Arsenal giving 2 talks at DEF CON. So love to see some of you guys there. Thanks again.